don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think.
King Charles has spent his entire life waiting to be king, but just a few years after ascending the throne, his limits are being tested. A family scandal has erupted, and Camilla is at the center of it. Now, the king has no choice but to step back and allow Prince William to take control. But what exactly is happening? Let's get into the details. The weight of a crown. King Charles had always known that the crown carried a cost. When he was diagnosed with cancer in February 2024, the palace reassured the public that he was receiving treatment and remained committed to his duties. Charles himself was determined to stay visible. He understood that a monarch who disappears from public life creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is something the palace works very hard to prevent. From the moment his diagnosis became public, the challenge was not just medical, it was also about keeping up the appearance of a functioning king during a period of genuine fragility. Charles returned to public duties relatively quickly after his diagnosis, appearing at engagements and receiving guests at Windsor Castle. His schedule was lighter than it had been before, but he was present. The palace managed his workload carefully, selecting appearances that were important but not physically demanding. To the public, he looked calm and composed, but those who watched him closely for the following months noted that something had changed in the texture of his daily life. The ease with which he had once moved through a full day of royal duties was gone, replaced by a more slower pace that reflected the reality of what his body was managing. His treatment continued throughout 2024 and into 2025. The palace provided occasional updates, each one carefully worded to convey progress without offering details that might fuel speculation. Soon, it was confirmed that he had returned to Windsor Castle following a brief period of additional medical attention. The palace framed this as part of his ongoing care rather than a setback. But the fact that his treatment was still active more than a year after his diagnosis told its own story. Cancer treatment at that level, over that duration, leaves a lasting mark. Charles was managing his condition in a way that required constant attention and adjustment. In October 2025, Charles made the decision to formally remove his brother Andrew from royal duties and from his home at Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. This was not a decision that was made casually. Andrew was his younger brother, and whatever the public thought of Andrew's conduct and associations, the private reality of removing a sibling from the life he had always known was a painful one. Charles had spent years attempting to manage the Andrew situation with minimal disruption, hoping each time that the controversy would settle. By that time, it was clear that it wouldn't, and the cost of continued inaction had become too high for the institution to bear. The Epstein files had been a recurring source of pressure on the royal family for years, but the documentation that circulated in 2025 was more detailed and more damaging than previous releases. Andrew's name appeared throughout in ways that could not be ignored or explained away. Charles understood that every day Andrew remained in a royal residence and retained the trappings of his former status was a day the palace's credibility was being eroded. The decision to act was the right one institutionally, but it cost Charles something personally, and that cost was visible to the people around him in the weeks that followed. By the end of the year, Charles addressed his health situation in a public Christmas message that acknowledged his treatment while projecting a sense of gratitude and continuity. The palace confirmed that his cancer treatment was moving into a different phase in the new year. This was presented as encouraging news, and there was genuine relief among those who cared about him. But the language remained cautious. Full remission was not confirmed. A complete return to the previous level of royal duties was not promised. The palace was being honest about the limits of what it knew and what it could guarantee, and that honesty itself reflected the seriousness of the situation. What made Charles's position particularly difficult to process was the timing. He had become king in September 2022 at the age of 73, following the passing of his mother Queen Elizabeth after 70 years on the throne. He had spent his entire life preparing for the role. He had developed views on architecture, the environment, organic farming, and the future of the Commonwealth that he had always intended to bring into his reign in a more direct way. He had barely begun to do that when the cancer diagnosis arrived. The sense that his reign might be defined more by what he was unable to do than by what he had managed to accomplish was a painful reality for him to accept. Those who spent time with Charles in early 2026 described a man who was engaged and thoughtful, but also carried a visible tiredness that went beyond the physical. He was asking the right questions. He was still performing the functions of his role with care and dignity, but the energy that had once made him seem almost restless in his commitment to his causes had settled into something more resigned. He was a king still doing his job, but he was also a man coming to terms with the gap between what he had planned for his reign and what had actually been possible. That gap, more than anything else, was what his family found hardest to watch. Filling the gaps. The shift in William's role during the recent years was not marked by any announcement or formal ceremony. It happened gradually, through an accumulation of responsibilities and a steady expansion of his presence in areas that had previously been the exclusive domain of his father. Those who follow the mechanics of royal life closely began noticing the pattern in the middle of 2025. William's schedule had grown significantly. He was representing the crown at events of a scale and importance that reflected more than a son helping an unwell father. He was being positioned in a way that the institution had clearly thought through and finally chosen to pursue. One of the most visible markers of this shift came when William traveled to Brazil in November 2025 to represent the United Kingdom at COP30, the major international climate summit. This was a high-profile appearance on the world stage at an event with genuine geopolitical weight. Charles, who had spent decades championing environmental causes and had attended many such summits himself, did not go. William went in his place, and he did so with the kind of confident and substantive engagement that made clear he was not simply filling a seat. He was operating as the primary royal voice on an issue of global importance, and the world received him as such. Back in Britain, the changes were equally significant but less visible to the public. William's household was being given access to briefings and consultations that had previously been routed only through Charles's office. The practical justification was continuity planning, ensuring that the heir was fully informed and capable of stepping in without disruption if circumstances required it. This was a reasonable explanation, and it was not inaccurate, but it described only part of what was happening. The access William was gaining went beyond what a contingency plan requires. It reflected an institution that was actively building his authority in real time, rather than simply preparing for a future possibility. The Andrew situation gave William an early opportunity to demonstrate the kind of decisive leadership that the palace needed from him. When the pressure on Charles to act against Andrew became impossible to ignore, William was not passive. He made his position clear internally. He pushed for a resolution that was firm, swift, and outright, both because he believed it was right for the institution and because he understood that how the palace handled the crisis would shape public confidence in the monarchy for years to come. His willingness to take a strong position on a painful family matter showed those inside the palace that he was ready to make difficult decisions when they were necessary. What also became clear during this period was how William's relationship with the palace's institutional structure had matured. He was no longer operating as someone who needed to be managed or guided through complex decisions. He was the one doing the guiding. 126, 132. Senior figures who advised the monarchy were engaging with him as the primary decision-maker on strategic questions about the crown's direction, its public messaging, and its long-term positioning. These were not conversations that would have taken place in that form even 2 years earlier. The institution had made a judgment about where its future lay, and it was acting on that judgment consistently and carefully. Catherine's recovery and return to fuller royal duties during that period added an important dimension to William's growing authority. Her presence alongside him gave their partnership a stability and completeness that reinforced the sense that this was not just one man stepping into a larger role, but two people building something together. Catherine had approached her return to public life with a seriousness and focus that impressed those around her. She had made clear choices about where she wanted to direct her energy, and the work she was developing around early childhood development gave her role a substance that went beyond ceremonial appearances. The dynamic between William and Camilla also became a defining feature of this period. There were internal conversations happening within William's circle that Camilla was not included in or was informed about only after the fact. In the palace's culture, inclusion in key conversations is one of the clearest indicators of where real authority resides. Being kept outside those conversations, even occasionally, is a meaningful signal. Camilla's exclusion was not total or constant, but it was noticeable to those paying attention, and it reflected the degree to which the institutional center of gravity had shifted toward William's household. William had not yet been crowned and nothing had been formally announced. Charles remained king and continued to carry out the duties his health allowed, but within the palace, the operational reality was clear. The major decisions about the monarchy's direction, its responses to ongoing controversies, and its planning for the years ahead were being shaped primarily by William. Charles was informed and respected, and his input still mattered. But the forward momentum of the institution belonged to his son. The transition, in every practical sense, was already underway, and the only remaining question was when the public acknowledgement would come. The scandal, Camilla's worst moment. Camilla had worked for years to build a stable and accepted place for herself within the British royal family. The journey had not been easy. When she married Charles in April 2005, large portions of the British public viewed her with hostility, and that feeling did not drain quickly. She managed it with patience and consistency, staying out of controversy, doing her public duties without seeking attention, and letting time to do what argument never could. By the time Charles became king, her position had stabilized considerably. She was named queen in the coronation proceedings, a decision that had stirred some debate, but had ultimately passed without derailing the day. The Jeffrey Epstein files had caused serious damage to the royal family. Andrew's connection to Epstein had been a source of sustained crisis for years, resulting in his civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre in 2022 and his gradual removal from public royal life. Charles's later decision to formally strip Andrew of his remaining royal associations and ask him to vacate Royal Lodge was the institution's most definitive response yet to the ongoing reputational damage. It was a painful decision, but a necessary one, and it was received by the public and the press as evidence that the palace was willing to take the problem seriously. For a brief period, it appeared that the palace had managed to draw a very clear line. That sense of resolution did not last. The documentation released in 2025 began focusing attention on the social network surrounding Epstein and his associates. Sarah Ferguson, the former wife of Prince Andrew, was a name that appeared in this context with enough frequency and detail to revive public interest in her own connections to the scandal. Sarah had previously confessed receiving financial assistance through Epstein and had apologized for it publicly. That apology had mostly settled the matter on the surface. But the new documentation placed her in a broader social context that went further than the financial connection, and the coverage that followed was substantial. The relationship between Sarah and Camilla wasn't a secret. The two women had maintained a friendship over the years that had occasionally been reported on as an unlikely but genuine bond. In normal circumstances, this would have been an unremarkable detail about two women who had both navigated complex and public lives within the orbit of the royal family. In the context of the recent controversy with the Epstein coverage generating fresh pressure on everyone connected to Andrew's world, it became something the palace could not dismiss. William made clear that he viewed the continued public visibility of that friendship as a risk the institution could not afford to carry. The message that reached Camilla was direct. The friendship with Sarah needed to end, or at the very minimum needed to become entirely invisible. This was framed as an institutional necessity rather than a personal judgment, but the distinction did not soften its impact. Camilla had navigated enough palace politics over the decades to understand what was being asked of her and what the consequences of refusing or hesitating might be. She had survived long enough in this world to know that the institution's tolerance has limits, and that those limits can shift fast when pressure builds from the right direction. In the weeks that followed, Camilla did not publicly distance herself from Sarah. She went mute on the matter entirely. Her public schedule continued without interruption, and she performed her duties with the same composed reliability that had always defined her public presence. But the silence around the specific question of her friendship with Sarah was noticed. Journalists who were paying attention to the story began asking why the palace had not offered any clarification. The absence of a statement, in a media environment where absence is quickly interpreted as confirmation, allowed the story to continue building in ways the palace had hoped to prevent. The press coverage that developed around Camilla during this period was different in tone from anything she had faced in recent years. It was not the old hostility rooted in the history of her relationship with Charles. It was a newer, more politically charged scrutiny that connected her to the ongoing reputational crisis around the Epstein files. Columnists, who had written about her generously for years, began publishing more cautious and questioning pieces. Social media amplified the criticism faster than any official response could keep pace with. And the carefully managed image of Camilla as a stable and uncontroversial presence beside the king was developing visible cracks. Inside the palace, the effect of all of this on Charles was significant. He had invested deeply in Camilla's acceptance and had fought for her place in the institution for decades. The thought that her position was now generating institutional risk at a moment when his own health was limiting his ability to manage such crises was deeply distressing for him. Palace aides managed the situation as gently as they could, keeping the most difficult conversations away from him where possible. But Charles was not naive about palace dynamics, and he understood what the cooling atmosphere around his wife meant. If care is not taken, it would solidify in no time. The power shift begins. The British monarchy has always managed its internal transitions with extreme discretion. The institution's survival over centuries has depended in large part on its ability to adapt without appearing to be in crisis, to change course without announcing that a change of course was necessary. The shifts that began taking place inside Buckingham Palace late last year and accelerated into this year followed this pattern precisely. No formal statement was issued, but the adjustments being made to how the palace operated were clear and consistent, and they pointed unmistakably in a single direction. The first area where the shift became apparent was in how official communications were structured. Most of the substantive work that went directly to Charles's office began routinely including William's team in the same correspondence. The stated reason was continuity planning, and the practical need to keep the heir fully briefed given the ongoing demands of Charles's health management. Continuity planning is a legitimate institutional function and one that the palace takes seriously. But the scope and regularity of what was being shared with William's office went beyond what contingency planning typically requires, and those inside the palace understood the difference. Scheduling decisions also began to reflect the shift in a visible way. Events and engagements that would have previously been arranged around Charles's diary as a matter of course were now being offered first to William's household for consideration. In some cases, William's team accepted engagements that Charles might have taken in earlier years. In others, Charles still attended while William was briefed in detail beforehand. The effect was a gradual rebalancing of the royal calendar that placed William at the center of the monarchy's public presence on an increasing number of occasions. The palace described this publicly as William supporting his father. Internally, the truth was different. The relationship between William's household and key government departments was also evolving. In the British constitutional system, the working relationship between the monarch and government is deeply practical and built on regular, strong communication. The fact that William's team was developing more direct and more substantive lines of communication with departments that had previously engaged almost exclusively with Charles's office was a structural development that did not happen by accident. It requires institutional intention and cooperation from both the palace and the relevant government offices. The groundwork for a functioning reign was being laid and ahead of any formal notice. Charles remained fully informed throughout this process. The people managing the transition were careful to ensure that nothing happened without his awareness and, where his input was sought, without his involvement. The goal was not to sideline him or diminish his dignity. It was to protect him from the full weight of governance at a moment when his health required him to conserve his energy, while also ensuring that the institution did not stall or become directionless during a period of genuine uncertainty about the future. The two things could coexist as long as the process was managed with respect and care, and the palace was determined to manage it that way. Camilla's position within this shifting structure was one of the most delicate aspects of the entire transition. As William's household became more central to the day-to-day operation of the monarchy, Camilla's access to key conversations diminished in ways that were subtle but real. She continued performing her public duties and maintained her title and her schedule, but the internal circle where strategic decisions were being made had narrowed around William and his team, and she was not consistently part of it. Palace culture is acutely sensitive to these kinds of shifts. Those who work within the institution read the signals clearly, even when nothing is stated explicitly. A significant internal meeting took place in late January, involving Charles and his most senior advisors. The details of what was discussed remained private, as such meetings always do. But the adjustments that followed in the weeks after suggested that the conversations had been important and that decisions had been reached about how to proceed. William's team gained formal access to materials and briefings that had previously required a separate request. His household's operational structure was upgraded in ways that reflected a more permanent and senior role. The language used internally to describe his position was very much notable. By February, the palace had established what amounted to a dual structure of authority. Charles remained king, performed his ceremonial duties, and was involved in decisions that required his direct participation. William managed the forward-facing work of the institution, the strategic planning, the key relationships, and the major decisions about how the monarchy would respond to ongoing challenges. The two operated in parallel rather than in competition, and the care taken to protect Charles's dignity throughout the process was genuine. But the center of operational power had moved, and the formalization of that movement was, by this point, only a matter of time. The Royal Succession Plan. The British monarchy never leaves anything to chance. Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, teams of officials spend years working through every detail of what must happen when a reigning monarch passes away. These preparations are updated regularly, adjusted as circumstances change, and kept ready to be activated at any moment. The goal is always the same: to ensure the institution moves forward without confusion, without delay, and without any visible sign of disorder. The monarchy's strength has always depended on its ability to absorb enormous change while projecting complete stability to the world watching from outside. When the moment comes, the first people to be told will be those closest to the king. The royal family will be informed immediately, followed within minutes by the Prime Minister. Only after those closest to power have been reached will the news be shared with the general public. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, a formal notice edged in black will be posted, a simple but deeply symbolic act that has marked the death of British monarchs for generations. Across the country, flags will be lowered to half-mast. The atmosphere in Britain will shift quickly and collectively, as the nation moves from its usual rhythm into a period of mourning and national reflection. William will become king the instant Charles breathes his last. There will be no waiting period, no ceremony required, and no formal vote. The transfer of the crown happens automatically under British law, passing from one monarch to the next in the same breath that marks the end of one reign and the beginning of another. The coronation, however, is a separate matter entirely. It is a complex, months-long undertaking involving hundreds of participants, intricate logistics, and ceremonial tradition. Charles himself waited 8 months after his mother's passing before his coronation took place. William would almost certainly face a similar or longer timeline before that ceremony was formally arranged. In the days following Charles's passing, his body would be moved to Westminster Hall, where members of the public would be invited to pay their respects as he lies in state. The scenes that followed Queen Elizabeth's passing in September 2022 showed exactly how powerful this moment can be. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in lines stretching for miles along the Thames, waiting for hours in the cold just to walk past her coffin and bow their heads in silence. That same depth of public feeling would almost certainly surround Charles's lying in state, giving the nation a shared and physical way to mark the end of his reign before the formal ceremonies of burial begin. The palace's internal plan for managing Charles's end has been given a specific operational name, as all major royal contingency plans are. It is called Operation Menai Bridge, a name drawn from the famous suspension bridge that connects mainland Wales The name connects directly to Charles's long-held title as Prince of Wales, a title he held for over 60 years before becoming king. Planning under this name began in earnest following Queen Elizabeth's funeral, with the palace using the experience of managing that enormous operation to sharpen and improve the preparations for whatever came next. After Charles has been buried and the period of national mourning has concluded, attention will turn to William's coronation. This ceremony will make his kingship official in the eyes of the world and the Church, even though he will already have been serving as king in every legal and practical sense since the moment of Charles's death. History suggests the wait could be considerable. Queen Elizabeth II waited 16 months after her father, King George VI, passed away before she was crowned in June 1953. A coronation on that scale requires huge preparation, and William's team would need every bit of that time to do it properly. At present, there is no indication that Charles is unable to carry out his duties. Despite his cancer diagnosis and treatment, he has continued meeting with the Prime Minister and maintaining an active schedule of royal engagements. But if his condition were to worsen significantly, British law provides a formal mechanism for managing the situation without requiring him to abdicate. The Regency Act of 1937 allows royal duties to be transferred to the next in line when a monarch becomes unable to perform them. Under this arrangement, William would take on the full responsibilities of the role without yet holding the title of king. For this act to be invoked, at least 3 of 5 senior figures would need to agree formally in writing. Those individuals are Queen Camilla, the Lord Chancellor, the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Lady Chief Justice, and the Master of the Rolls. Notably, Charles himself would have no role in approving or blocking the decision. The last time a similar arrangement was used in Britain was approximately 200 years ago, when the future King George IV served as Prince Regent during his father's illness. If Charles passes away before Camilla, she would most likely take on the title of Queen Dowager, recognizing her as the widow of a king. She would not be given the title of Queen Mother, as that designation belongs to the mother of the reigning monarch, a role that was always meant for Princess Diana. Camilla would be expected to leave Buckingham Palace and settle into a smaller private residence, much as Queen Elizabeth's mother moved to Clarence House following her husband's passing. Camilla would still continue her charitable work and retain certain honorary military roles, all shaped in coordination with William as the new king. Do you think Prince William would become king anytime soon? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.